Hey guys, welcome to the channel. It's Jack with Stronghold Strength and Conditioning. And today, I've got 6 bodyweight strength exercises that everybody should master. But before we get into it, make sure you take a moment and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss out on future content like this. Every Thursday, I'm putting out videos on resolving aches and pains, preventing injury, and overall optimizing your performance. And it doesn't get much cooler than that. So go ahead, click that button. Ready? Let's dive into this one. All right guys, the topic of the day, 6 bodyweight strength exercises that everyone should master. And you know there's a lot of bodyweight training going on these days with the gyms being closed and quarantine going on. So I wanted to touch on these 6 most fundamental exercises that we can really master while we're at home so we can get the most out of our training once the gyms open back up and we do have access to the strength training equipment once again. If you don't have these 6 exercises mastered and you don't truly know what the basic technique and form should be, well, you're probably going to hit a plateau, or you're probably going to be at a point where you're putting yourself at risk for injury when you are loading up these exercises. So we want to make sure that we have technique and form down to a T, that we're able to perform the exercise with good mobility, we have access to the range of motion that we should, and that we're feeling the things engaging that we should. And if we can get that down, then we're going to be in pretty good shape, like I said, once those gyms open back up. Exercise number 1, the air squat. So the very first thing that we want to be looking at is your ability to squat body weight without any load. Are you able to get into a full depth squat? That means hips below the knees without any major faults that are showing up. One of the most common things we see in a squat is that the setup is the very initial part of the problem. We set up improperly, we actually don't take any time to set up, and then we move through the squat and have faulty spinal mechanics which limit our overall mobility downstream at the leg and our ability to get into a deeper squat. Of course, there might be other mobility limitations such as ankle dorsiflexion or knee flexion that we really need to be aware of. But part of improving our mobility overall is making sure that we know how to functionally move and use the patterning and coordination of the movement very well. So the better we move, that in turn is going to also help our mobility improve overall in the movement. So that is a big part of it. The very first thing we would want to do is start with a core bracing sequence that really organizes the spinal column and starts to engage our legs with some torque and torsion. Torque from the hip, torsion through the system of the leg. So it's very important that we have a very good foot setup. So for the feet, we want 3 points of contact, the first metatarsal, the fifth metatarsal, and the heel on each foot. That is going to be our main base that we're working from. So our feet are very active here, and I should have my arches during the squat. If I'm flat-footed to begin with, this might be part of the problem. You might not know how to generate torque and torsion through the system of your leg to actually create those arches and maintain those arches through a squat. So this could be something that you focus on and practice. So we have those 3 points of contact. We want the feet set about hips distance apart, making sure that maybe slightly wider than the hips at most is our setup. That's going to make sure that we have the ability to actually create that torsion. So torsion is generated by the torque from the hip, but also the friction from the floor. And that's where we get the cues like screwing the feet in the floor or spinning the feet on dinner plates, you name it, something along those lines. So we have that torsion effect where we're screwing the feet into the floor. We have those 3 points of contact, feet are hips distance apart. I also want my feet to be about 0 to 30 degrees on the turnout. I want to make sure that my feet aren't turning out too wide. If my feet turn out too wide, I lose the ability to actually generate torque at the hip. Now, when we talk about torque and torsion, torque is the rotational effect at the hip. The torsion is actually almost like comparable to intra-abdominal pressure. So we have this internal pressure of the leg that is stabilizing the system of the leg while I'm squatting. So that's all in just the setup of the feet right there. I have 3 points of contact on each foot. I have my feet 0 to 30 degrees on a turnout, and my feet are hips distance or slightly wider apart. From there, I need to be engaging my quadriceps very strong. So I'm flexing the quads, my legs are straight, I'm pushing the floor away as I'm screwing the feet into the floor there. With those quads engaged, I'm gonna flex my butt. So I'm extending my hip and externally rotating. When I externally rotate the hip, what you should see is your kneecaps actually turn open toward your middle or smallest toes of your feet. And that's the alignment we wanna keep the knees in throughout the squat from top to bottom. So at this point, I should have a lot of tension through the leg, and this is the torque and torsion that I'm talking about. So I have torque and torsion driving through the floor, so I have a nice bit of tension, and I haven't even started my squat yet. Now, on top of that, I'm gonna add in some abdominal engagement to make sure that I'm holding the spinal column in a neutral position, and then I'm engaging the shoulder blades on the upper back, rolling them down and back, and trying to connect my armpits on the back side to my upper back here. So those are the main places that we really want to look. The last piece we'll say is just check the chin, tuck it to the Adam's apple there, and make sure that you're not arching your neck back. Now, when we start the actual movement of the squat, we want to make sure that we have a small hip hinge back, leading with the hips first, not even bending the knees yet. I have all that tension built up, and the very first thing I'm going to do is a hip hinge in a squat pattern. It's very small, don't worry. So as soon as you feel that little bit of load at the posterior side of your body there through the back of the legs, you're gonna start to bend the knees and actually draw the knees wide, pulling yourself down into the bottom position of the squat. As I said, our hips should drop below our knees, but the key is in the bottom position of the squat, we don't lose that torque and torsion. So my knees are continually driving wide with my feet still active and able to grip the floor through my 3 points of contact. Maintaining that torque and torsion, I return back to the top without any loss of tension in the torsion of the leg or my ability to brace the spinal column, which is where we started. So I want to keep a nice neutral spinal column, making sure that I'm not reverting into a flexed position of, usually we see it at the thoracic spinal column, rounding up at the upper back. And if we see that, it's usually some form of compensation for a lack of mobility. We're trying to create balance that we don't have, mainly because of our ankle dorsiflexion lacking. So that's a really big one, our ability to maintain that upright posture of the torso. And even in a body weight position, it's gonna lean more. Now, if we're doing this loaded, it would be a little bit different because as the bar gets loaded in different positions on our spinal column, this changes the demand of the uprightness of the torso. So I hope you guys followed me on all that, but driving back up to the standing position and going right back to our starting position overall. So a lot of tension in the upper back, abdomen, glutes, quads, and having that torsion screwing into the floor. And in a nutshell, that's your squat. Exercise number 2, the hip thrust. So for the hip thrust, we choose this because it is our hip hinge essentially that we really are trying to practice. And I choose the hip thrust because of the fact that less of the spinal column is supported and more of the glute engagement that we get from having the shoulders elevated in a hip thrust position. Now, you could use a glute bridge, but like I said, the spinal column is a little more supported in the glute bridge and it won't transfer quite as well to exercises such as a deadlift when you get back into the gym. So being able to truly perform a nice hip hinge in the hip thrust position, and you can use, a couch, you could use a coffee table, it doesn't matter, just so you have the shoulders elevated and you're kind of in a nice tabletop position and you can get to that height. So the main setup here that we really want to focus on is a good positioning with the edge of whatever you're using, your couch, your bench, if you have one at home, coffee table. We want that to be mainly supporting the scapula and the head in the beginning position in that tabletop position here. Just like the squat, we're gonna have our feet set up very similar. So we wanna make sure that we have 3 points of contact from each foot. The feet are parallel with that 0 to 30 degree angle of turnout and making sure they're about hips distance apart. So we have the Feet set up very similar to the squat. The only difference is we're gonna have that 90-degree bend at the knee in the tabletop position here of the hip thrust. At the top position of it, I wanna make sure that I'm engaging the glutes very well by driving the hips up, and we're really looking at our ability to fully extend the hips here. This is a nice one to check that out, making sure I have full extension of the hips, driving the hips up by lifting the hips from the glutes and also externally rotating at the hip again to generate that torque and torsion that transfers in. So the knees are driving wide, the hips are driving high, and that's what gives me full tension at the gluteals, really supporting the lowest portion of my spinal column. My abs are engaged, my shoulder blades are rolled down and back, my chin is tucked to my Adam's apple. From here, I really need to practice pivoting at 2 points here of contact. One, I'm pivoting at that edge of the bench or the couch, whatever you're using, at the base of the shoulder blades, making sure that that's one pivot point. The second one is the pivot point from the hips themselves. So keeping my torsion through the leg, I want to make sure that I'm able to lower and hinge at the hips, pivot at the base of the shoulder blades there, and lower into a full depth position. Now I'm making sure that when I lower in that I'm not changing my spinal positioning at all. We did that whole setup for a reason. My spine is organized, I have it very well controlled at that point, and I want to keep it braced and well controlled in that position. I'm going to drive back up just like the squat, making sure that my knees aren't caving, to full extension of the hips with the knees still pulling wide. And that is our hip hinge. Exercise number 3, the split lunge. So for the split lunge, I'm in a position where I want to start with the legs already in a split stance. Now we're taking out any movement here because we want to strip it down to the very basics. And once again, it comes down to my ability to actually set up really well for this positioning. So from the front foot, I want to set it up as basically half of my squat position. 3 points of contact from the foot, first metatarsal, fifth metatarsal heel. I'm going to be screwing that foot into the floor, and then I'm actually using the hip here to do that, to make sure that my foot is in a 0 to 30 degree turnout, but even that 30 degrees might be a bit much for the split lunge stance. From the back leg of the stance, we're actually going to do something a little bit different here. We want to internally rotate the hip when the leg is in extension there behind us. So what we want to do to create that stability is internally rotate by actually anchoring my smallest toes. And I should be stepped far enough back that I can't really step any further back at this point. Making sure though, one big thing here is that I'm not compensating from my pelvis. So if I don't have the ability to fully extend my hip, what's gonna happen is I'm either gonna compensate at my lumbar spine and see this big arching because I've stepped back and I don't have extension at the hip, so something's gotta extend. That would be my lumbar spine. Or I'm going to feel very much restriction through the quadriceps of that back leg, and I possibly won't even get down to the ground, which is ultimately the full goal. We need to be able to get down to the ground and back up, making sure we have that full range of motion from that fully extended hip position. So it's really cool in the lunge because we have one hip that's working in external rotation, we have one hip that's working in internal rotation, and both of those are working together to create the stability at our pelvis here in this positioning. So I want to make sure my glutes are engaged here, making sure that I have that stable position, I'm not arching at the lumbar spine, and my pelvis is supported well. On top of that, once again, bracing the abdomen, rolling the shoulder blades down and back, making sure my shoulders are actually pretty much straight in line with my hips. From there, I'm going to be lowering straight down. You want to think of like an elevator. You shouldn't feel anything shifting side to side, front to back. It should be literally straight down and literally straight back up. And if you have that elevator feel, then we're in a good shape there. And you should be able to, as I said, get to the ground from this position with those legs in a nice split stance. So my knee on the front leg as I'm going down is going to open up toward my smallest toes just like a squat, and it's going to maintain that little bit of open pull toward my smallest toes as I return back to standing. My back leg, I want to make sure that hip is driving in from the glutes in extension there. that I might even feel a little stretch at my hip flexors because my glutes are engaging. And that would show you a little bit about your hip flexors if they're tight. One of the quadriceps, actually, rectus femoris, is also double action as a hip flexor. So if you're tight through your quadriceps, there's a good chance you're also tight through your hip flexors, which is going to limit your lunge, which might also be why you get knee pain in lunges, or something that restricts you at the knees in a lunging position often. So if you can't get full range of motion on the lunge, it's probably because those quadriceps and hip flexors, poor control of the lower region of your spinal column, which is that pelvis. Okay, so we're lowering in that elevator feel straight down, raising back up, feeling the glutes lifting us, making sure we can keep that nice straight line. If you need to make this a little bit more difficult, you can start to elevate the back leg. So we do a Bulgarian split squat to make this a little bit more challenging of a setup if you're past this split stance position. Exercise number 4, the push-up. All right, guys, you know there's a lot of push-ups going on right now. So we want to make sure that the setup is stellar. And these are one of those exercises that we take for granted, that we assume that we really have the form automatically locked in and it's perfect and it's all good because I can lower myself in. But if you can't get reps, there's probably a good chance that you're not actually performing the push-up that well. And if you're not ever seeing progress with your push-up, there's a good chance that you're not actually performing the push-up that well. So we want to make sure that the setup is the very first place we begin on the push-up, just like all the rest that we've been talking about. So in this system, the push-up is based and anchored in the setup of the arms, similar to an air squat. I want to be able to generate torque at the shoulders and torsion through the system of the arm, with the hands being the base in this position. So with the hands, I want to place them so they're about wrist below the shoulder, with the hands about shoulder width apart. I want to make sure that with that I'm actually beginning on my hands and knees to set this up. And I'm taking all the pressure off in the beginning. There's really no pressure on the hands until the very final step of our setup here. So I'm going to be rolling the shoulder blades down and back and screwing the shoulder so that the elbows are rotating in toward my body. That's generating that torque and torsion that creates stability through the system of the arm overall. And that'll create stability through my core in turn. So once I have that shoulder positioning set, elbows rotated in, I feel that same screwing effect from my hands that I would in an air squat, then I can actually take a step further, brace the abdomen, engage the abdomen, making sure that I'm once again organizing the spinal column step by step from head down in. I should note that you also want to make sure that your chin is tucked toward your Adam's apple again. If you haven't got the gist of it, we're kind of getting a pattern here. So chin to Adam's apple, abdomen engaged, torque and torsion through the arms, and then I'm adding in the final step, the extension of the hip by driving the glutes tight and the quadriceps as I finally step back into a tall plank position. This tall plank is the start and the finish of my push-up. It's the organization of the spinal column and tension that I need to maintain through the push-up. So what I want to do is keep that tension that I've built up just in the setup and actually keep screwing the hands into the floor as I lower into the push-up. I should feel the push-up more in my lats and my armpits, my upper back, than I do in my actual chest and the front of my shoulders, honestly, if I'm performing it right. I should also feel it a lot in my core, making sure that I'm working hard to actually maintain that organized spinal column that I set up in the very beginning. So the glutes are tight, the quads are tight, I'm lowering into the bottom of the push-up. Then as I push back up, I'm making sure that I'm keeping tension through the arms by keeping those elbows rotated in and making sure that I don't push into a protracted position of the scapula, because at that point I'm pulling myself out of my organized spinal positioning and I'm losing my control of the spinal positioning at that point in order to finish the push. It's kind of like people do on a bench press as well. We lose that scapular connection to the bench when we protract because we're trying to push that weight and we take it just that extra inch further. So for this basic push-up, we don't want that spinal flexion unless it becomes intentional. And at some point you might see some push-ups performed where there is an intent to the actual spinal flexion and protraction at the top of the push-up. And you might see that a little bit more in calisthenics practice, but don't get it confused with what your basic control should be in the beginning. If you're having trouble performing push-ups from the floor, elevate the hands. Don't bend the knees, because what you're doing is you actually lose your ability to generate the torque and stabilize the lower half of our spinal column from there, meaning that you won't be able to actually perform the real push-up ever, because you're never developing the strength that you need to perform the real push-up. Exercise number 5, our pull-up. So obviously, if you're at home and you might not have access to a pull-up bar, this is gonna limit you a little bit. So I'm gonna give you some options here for this one in order to build some back strength when you're at home and when you might not actually have access to equipment. Now, obviously, the pull-up is one of the best body weight exercises that we can build strength with in a vertical pulling position. But we can actually work a horizontal pull as well, and it's a little bit easier than you might actually think. And I don't mean easy in the fact that it's easy to perform, it's actually just, it doesn't require much as far as your setup goes. So for this one, what you're gonna be using is actually a pull, a drive right into the floor. And we're just gonna use the floor and isometrics to create the tension that we really need to be able to build and the strength that we need to build in the first place. So what I want to do is set up similar to the push-up by rolling my shoulder blades down and back and getting the shoulders set in a good position. I'm going to be on my back in this position, so I'm rolling them down and back, getting the shoulder blades as far down and back as I can, and I'm keeping the elbows in at the side while I do this to help myself set up. My head will be down on the floor, and what I'm going to start with, in the very easiest version of this, and really probably the place to begin, is actually keeping the knees bent where the feet are planted, almost as if you were going to do a glute bridge. So I want to make sure that I have those just kind of relaxed down there at first. I'm going to tuck the tailbone a little bit into posterior pelvic tilt so that I really feel my abdomen engaging in this position. And that's what you're going to do. You're actually going to take the curvature out of the lumbar spine and imprint the lumbar spine so that we have a good braced core. And we're really taking out any risk of compensating through the spinal column as we attempt to actually lift ourselves off the floor by driving the elbows down and into the floor. So I'm going to take the elbows out to about a 30 to 45 degree angle, similar to our push-up once again, off of the rib cage. So I have them slightly wide. You can almost think of your setup for if you were doing a bent row. That range that we would be pulling the bar to the rib cage is about where we would want the hands to be set up in this position. So from there, I'm going to be driving my elbows into the floor and literally trying to lift my upper back from the floor. It's almost like doing a crunch assisted by a little bit of your elbow at that point. There's really a great way that we could challenge our upper back strength right there and our posterior chain strength right there, just using our floor alone. All right, guys, and last but not least, exercise number 6 is the side plank. Now, I choose the side plank because it really basically is the most similar form to doing a carry. The only real difference is instead of a weight actually pulling at the shoulder, we get a little bit of pressure inward from the floor up into the shoulder. Either way, we still need to be able to control the overall spinal alignment in the setup for a side plank. So for this one, the most basic place that I would begin is actually a bent knee side plank. So my knees are bent back behind me like kickstands, one leg on top of the other. I want to set the shoulder well by rolling it down and back, and I'm actually feeling the musculature of the backside of my armpit engaging. So I'm kind of externally rotating in that position, generating torque through, you can do this bent arm, you can do this fully extended arm, but it's a little bit easier to actually set up with a fully extended arm because we can use the torque at the shoulder a little bit easier as compared to if I were doing it from the forearm. Similar to a tall plank versus a low plank, it's easier to set up the tall plank with a proper setup of the shoulders and stability at the shoulders versus the low plank because I have the ability to generate torque and torsion through the system of the arm. So here you can do fully extended arm. Your fingertips, we want to make sure start facing forward and externally rotate the shoulder, drawing that elbow in toward the ribs. You could also turn the fingers up toward the head if you're having trouble with that external rotation at the shoulder and rolling that elbow toward your rib cage. But either way, we want to feel that musculature at the back of the armpit engaging, and if you don't, we're probably not set up right. That's the big key. So once I have that shoulder set, I want to make sure that from there I'm engaging the glutes and I'm also engaging the obliques here. So the underside of my body closest to the floor should be pretty lit up from the armpit all the way through the obliques into the gluteals. My top leg, I'm going to pull away from the bottom leg so that my glutes are engaging in external rotation there. My foot's actually going to drop in while the knee opens wide. So it's almost like my feet are going to try and touch together. Think like clamshell position in this one. So it's similar to a clamshell in a side plank position combined. I want to make sure that I have a straight line from my head through my shoulders into the hip and knee essentially. I shouldn't have any bend at the hips. I'm not in flexion at the hip at all. So we want to make sure that all the glutes are engaging by driving the pelvis forward and opening the knees away from one another in this bent knee side plank position. Once you've mastered the bent knee side plank position, you can take it into a fuller side plank position where one foot is on top of the other. And this is where it really will carry over more into your overall carries in the gym. So if I'm able to set up and properly generate the tension that I need to through the full side plank position, that is really where we're going to see benefits in carryover to actual carries when I go and lift again when a gym opens up. All right guys, there you have it. 6 bodyweight strength training exercises that you and everybody else should master. These are really the boiled down basics that we need to have a very strong understanding and have the skills to actually perform so that we can actually transfer them into strength gains in the gym when we do start to load up very similar exercises. If you understand these very most basic movement patternings, the coordination of these movements, and how they can transfer into other exercises that you're already doing in the gym, you will automatically reap the benefits of it because you'll understand torque and torsion, you'll understand spinal organization, and those right there will overall improve your strength and mobility. So start there. If you guys like this video, make sure you let me know by clicking that big thumbs up down below and share it with a friend. You know, we've got some extra time on our hands right now, so why not brush up on those body weight skills? If you guys have any questions about the exercises or let me know which ones you struggle with right now, make sure you drop that down below in the comments. And I will get back to you with some answers real quickly, I promise you that. And lastly, if you have not already, make sure you take a moment and hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss out on future content like this. Every Thursday, I put out videos talking about resolving aches and pains, preventing injuries, and overall optimizing your performance. And it really doesn't get much cooler than that. So, jump on it. I want to thank you guys for watching today. We'll see you next time.